see that you're all slowly joining us today in this webinar where we're going to be discussing about the EU need for a cybersecurity strategy. We have seen over the past few months that there are a lot of hybrid threats that we actually have to confront, and for that we need more cooperation between member states to make sure that we share information, that we have common responses to those threats. And for that, the EU launched in December 2020, so just 1 year ago, a new EU strategy for cybersecurity. And we're going to be discussing that. Where are we at? What are the main challenges that we are facing? What are the ways in which we can collaborate in between different member states with different capabilities to make sure that we are ready for that? And we have an amazing lineup of speakers for doing that, but we want you also to be part of the conversation, because the whole goal of these seminars is actually to have an open discussion about these issues and to share with each other the ideas and thoughts and suggestions that might be interesting for this conversation and to keep it ongoing. So if you too would like to be part of the conversation, please make sure that you share your question through our Q&A section that you're going to find on the bottom of the screen, and you can explain to us who you are, with the organization you're working for, and who are you addressing the question to. But to set up a little bit the scenario, to talk a little bit about the context in which we are in, we're going to have a first introduction, because unfortunately our MEP Svenja Han, who is a member of the European Parliament for the Renew Europe and the first president of the European Liberal Forum, couldn't join us today because she has the incredibly difficult task of being part of the negotiating team in Germany, where the formation of the government is still ongoing. So she couldn't join today, but she sent us a video that is going to very much give us some ideas about where are we and where do we have the conversation going. So here's that video.
Why does cybersecurity matter for European governments, business and citizens? The digital transformation and the technological progress offer many opportunities for our societies and economy. But there also are legitimate concerns about threats to our values and democracy. Digital technologies can be abused for disinformation, manipulation, mass surveillance or discrimination. We already observe this in countries like China with a social scoring system. We need to set a clear framework based on fundamental rights for the EU, so this does not become a major threat to our European security. Our democracy becomes vulnerable if our own data and institutions cannot be protected from external threats. This is why cybersecurity matters, also in private communication of individuals. The right for privacy must be protected online as it's protected offline. This also means ensuring a safe communication through end-to-end encryption. Moreover, a vulnerable digital infrastructure is a huge danger for our businesses and for society as a whole. Highly sensitive data of citizens, industry or governments must be safe, and we have still a long way to go. We need to create a secure and efficient data infrastructure in Europe in cooperation with our partners in democratic countries, not against them. Cybersecurity matters because we have to safeguard our democratic freedoms and citizens' fundamental rights. We must ensure that our measures and legislations are tackling the problems without threatening our citizens' freedoms.
Thank you so much, Tresmeni, for that introduction. I think she touched upon some of the issues that we absolutely would like to discuss today. This question of cybersecurity touching on many levels, of the question of a fair and free society, the question of a well-working democracy, but also about businesses indeed, because of the digitalization of the economy that we have seen over the past few years and that we're moving even forward. That's one of the objectives of the EU in its strategy for the coming years. So obviously we have to pay a lot of attention to that. And because we would like to learn a little bit more about where are we and where we're going, we're going to have a first intervention by Francesco Cappelletti, who is a research fellow at the Liberal Forum. I'm very much looking forward to hear from you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for this opportunity being in the panel with these amazing speakers today. And from my side, very briefly, What has been actually anticipated by Svenja is very important. We were wondering this month during our campaign and during the cybersecurity month in Europe, why does cybersecurity matter? Because if you go around and ask citizens, they may say, "Oh, it's just being safe when you surf the net and being safe online." Well, cybersecurity is not only that, because it's a transversal set of practices that aim to protect our critical infrastructures, our privacy, and our business. Indeed, there are different dimensions why they can answer the question why cybersecurity matter. One is the economic that was already said, and the economic and commercial dimension, because cybersecurity can represent a threat to the digital single market if it's not correctly implemented. There is also a more difficult question, which is the military dimension of cybersecurity. As you know, the increasing technological capabilities, in addition to traditional form of warfare that led to cyber warfare, hybrid warfare, and the new terms like surrogate war, are very important threat to our democracies and security. And then there is also the psychological weapon. Cybersecurity can be used as a psychological weapon and for social engineering practices. I was just going through the recently published report from ENISA. I'm sure that will be touched upon later with our other guests. And they added this misinformation and disinformation as a threat in the threat landscape of Europe, which is very important also in light of what we have been witnessing with the COVID and the disinformation campaign. And there was a sentence that I found in our book that great technical security can be subverted by going after people. That's indeed summing up what social engineering practices are. And all these threats not only concern our economy, market, or even defense, they also threat to our maybe one of the most important critical infrastructure that we have in Italy, that in Europe, that is our democracy. Democracy and democratic processes are a critical infrastructure to our European value citizens. And what we are witnessing, I'm going to conclude and leave the floor to the other speakers, that the scale on which these cyber criminals an operation in the cyberspace operate is moving toward a more industrialized approach. And what we need at level of EU member states, it's an industrialized response. We can think about just the very recent attack on supply chain, which was backed by state-affiliated group Cosiber. There was the SolarWind case 1 year ago. And it means that when cyber is used as a weapon to influence for foreign policy, the European Union should counter this threat and should address this threat also when it comes to diplomatic contacts. So cyber diplomacy should be implemented. This is, in my opinion. And this is very important. Again, just to conclude, again, quoting what ENISA just published, during the past year, the most the cyber attacks the public administration and governments, service provider, but mostly a general public, means citizen. So in order to go ahead and protect, we need probably to strengthen our resilience, to strengthen through skilling and reskilling and investing in in-house solution. Because it will help developing a cybersecurity industry, fostering the market and the internal market, and overall is a step toward achieving our own sovereignty in the cyber domain. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Francesco, because you have actually touched upon one of the issues that we haven't addressed yet, and is the question of the need for investment in innovation to make sure that we do have the capabilities to confront those threats. And we're going to be talking about that for sure during our conversation. But now I would like to turn myself to someone you've been sort of addressing indirectly during your speech, which is Laura Hoving, who is the spokesperson for the EU Agency for Cybersecurity, ENISA. And I'm sure that she has a lot to say about the way the EU is preparing itself to confront those threats.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you very much for having me and for inviting Anissa to the panel. Indeed, it's important that we're also having this discussion on cyber threats today, because it puts it on the political agenda, and we need to see more of that. So if as Francesco mentioned yesterday, the agency published its annual Anissa threat landscape, which provides a kind of overview of what are the main threats currently being faced in Europe and globally, also what are the trends we're seeing. It's a document that has both kind of technical and non-technical information. So that means that it can be used by incident responders to see how they can face the threats better. But it can also be used by many others, including policymakers, to see strategically how can we face the future better, and what are the threats that we're currently facing in order to plan better for future policy. And then the third kind of group that I would address, for that the threat landscape would address, is on the economic side. So we already mentioned investments, we already mentioned that the economic dimension is very important, but the threat landscape should also really be used by organizations. And there we hope by the top of the organizations, boardroom members should be looking at what the threats are and deciding how to invest in their own organization cybersecurity based on the threat landscape. So then what are the kind of threats that we found? Well, of course, the first thing is, unsurprisingly, is that the cybersecurity threats are on the rise. Particularly ransomware, we've seen now as a prime threat throughout this reporting period. And I think we've also had a number of very prominent ransomware attacks in the media. We saw the Irish Healthcare Services, we saw Colonial Pipeline in the US, and many others. But what we see with the threats is that they're not so much changing. Ransomware has been around for a very long time. Malware has been around, cryptojacking has been around, but really the threats are becoming more sophisticated, they're becoming more complex, and the impact is becoming greater. So the reason for that is, of course, partially is that we're moving more digital. We are transitioning from traditional infrastructures and moving towards online solutions, particularly throughout the COVID pandemic. We saw people moving online to do their work, to do their schooling, universities moved online, doctor's appointments moved online, etc. We also see that there's more advanced interconnectivity. Everything is starting to become more connected. This is the Internet of Things for ourselves as consumers, but also we're seeing this, for example, factories are becoming increasingly connected. And then for these new kind of technologies, we're also seeing a lot of new features. So we have artificial intelligence, we have many new technologies, 5G, and all of these features mean that the attack vectors and basically the space, the possibilities for attacking has become larger because there's many more attack points. The other thing that the threat landscape has found is, of course, an increase in supply chain attacks. So this is really important because they have such a kind of cascading effect. You can be a software provider in a third country, and that when you send your update for your software to all of your clients, which can be across Europe, across the world, you may unknowingly be spreading, let's say, malicious code through that software. So the effect, the impact that such an attack can have can be very catastrophic. And that's why we've also focused a lot on supply chain. Another thing that we saw, as Francesco mentioned, this is the first year that we have included disinformation and misinformation. This is extremely important because we're talking about when we are talking about protecting our democracies, this is a really important point. The disinformation campaigns are often used in a hybrid way, so that they're just trying to create this kind of mistrust. And the fact that in COVID pandemic, many people went not just online, but they were spending a lot more time on social media platforms. So this then increases the risks of disinformation and misinformation. And finally, one of the things that the threat landscape found was really this move towards hackers for hire, as we call it, But it is these, it's groups, specific cyber criminal groups that are becoming very large, and they're offering ransomware as a service, they're offering phishing as a service, they're offering all sorts of criminal activities that you can hire them for, and this is becoming specifically a trend that we're seeing, and now there's that is a challenge that we will face in the coming years. So that's kind of where we are with the threat landscape, but of course we are we see that there's a lot of threats, but then to understand a little bit better what is the current situation in Europe, we actually look at incidents and specifically what incidents are happening across Europe. So under the EU NIS directive, which is the Network Information Security Directive, certain critical infrastructure, so providers of essential services, critical infrastructure and digital service providers, they have reporting obligations. So when a cyber incident occurs, they have to report it to the national authorities. And again, once a year, ENISA collects all this information, analyzes it, and kind of understands to see what are the trends. So if we saw for 2019, you saw that there was 432 cyber incidents just in critical sectors. And these are just cyber incidents with significant impact, because those are the ones required to be reported. And then if we go 1 year later, in 2020, it already moved to 742. So this represents an increase of 72%. So this is already a huge increase, and that's just in Europe, and that's just for critical sectors. So, and this is kind of important for me as spokesperson. I'm trying to communicate about cybersecurity, why it's important, why do we need to keep it on the agenda. But the truth is that we're seeing almost 2 incidents a day in the EU, just in critical infrastructure. So if people will constantly, every day, see there's a cyber attack on a hospital, the next day, cyber attack on an energy provider, it becomes kind of white noise. You just think this is the new normal. And the truth is that there is a lot that we are doing about it, that we can do about it, and that we should do about it. So as the EU has kind of put together 3 important pillars. So the first one I already mentioned is the Network Information and Security Directive. This was the EU's first cybersecurity legislation, and that really already sets a very important framework for especially for critical infrastructure to protect those better. The second pillar is the Cybersecurity Act. This gives ENISA its mandate and sets the tasks. It also creates the cybersecurity certification framework, so that for new products and services that we start to certify these, which brings an extra level of security and trust into the market. And then the third pillar, I think we will also discuss a little bit, is the new European Competence Center, which is going to be this new body. It's currently being set up by the European Commission, that will provide funding to cybersecurity innovations and research in order to support this important element. And so together, these 3 will be really important, working together and creating more of a security across Europe.
I would actually have a lot of follow-ups on your intervention, because I thought it was very, very interesting in terms of like setting the actual situation in Europe. I was very surprised by these 2 incidents per day against critical infrastructure, because it seems like a really high trend of threats. Like if we think about that in any other terms, we will be very surprised, but because it's cyber, we're not so much aware of what's going on, and we might not be aware of the way the public authorities are actually fighting these threats. And so I would like to learn a little bit more about that and about what the EU is doing in practical terms. But before that, I would like to give the floor to our last speaker, who is Luigi Martino, and he's a PhD director on the Center for Cybersecurity and International Relations Studies, and a Professor of Cybersecurity and International Relations at the University of Florence. So please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Beatrice. Thank you very much to the European Libre Forum for inviting me. It's a very pleasure. It's an honor to be here. And I really appreciate the previous speakers about how it's very relevant to the topic of cybersecurity. It's a hot topic today, and in particular, I have the opportunity also to talk about ENISA, the ENISA role, and how ENISA represents a best practice around the world, according to empirical evidence, because I'm academic and then I talk about empirical evidence, of course. But let's start about the state of art of the European Union few years ago. Then when we start, and the starting point, then we start at the European Union level with a fragmented and heterogeneous situation among 28 or 27 states, it depends. But we assist in a fragmented situation where it seems impossible to implement any common regulatory framework in the field of cybersecurity for two main reasons. The first reason is the situation of the European Union per se. Then we represent a collection of states, independent states. At the same time, we have a problem, the big problem of cybersecurity, because cybersecurity is considered an internal affair of member states. It's considered a part of national security. Then we start at the European Union level with this situation. Fragmentation, heterogeneous, and another problem is an external problem of the European Union, the lack of a common regulatory framework at international level about cybersecurity, cyber threats, or cyberspace in general. Then this was the state of art in the field of cybersecurity during the post-decade. But now the situation is completely different. The situation is that several initiatives have been implemented by the European Union. And few, but in my opinion, all of these initiatives represent best practice around the world at international level. Then, for instance, just to mention some initiatives, then we have the Cybersecurity Strategy in 2013, but now we have another upload of the Cybersecurity Strategy, but we have also initiatives not on a strategic level, but also at legislative level. For instance, the NIS Directive, the GDPR, the Cybersecurity Act, and other initiatives are in the pipeline of the European Union decision makers. Then I would like to stress two main case studies, and then in the field of cybersecurity from a strategic and operational level. Then I would like to stress the two case studies that, in my opinion, represent the very best practice approach of the European Union. Then we have the GDPR, because the General Data Protection Regulation, it's connected to cybersecurity from a perspective of safe cyberspace and secure, but in particular safe in front of citizens of the European Union. Then GDPR is a regulatory framework, it's a regulation, and represents a best practice at international level. At the same aim, we have the main role of the ENISA, which becomes the permanent agency of the European Union in the field of cybersecurity. Then the first case, GDPR, then we can include also, for instance, the NIS Directive, but in particular, I think that if we have time to discuss about the new version of the NIS Directive 2, which is very interesting because in certain cases it's quite similar to the GDPR, in particular in the sanctionary framework, but also in the requirements. But GDPR is a clear empirical example that fragmentation can be solved with a top-down approach. Because with a top-down approach, the European Union was able to implement mandatory obligations. And this way it was possible to implement a regulatory framework in order to protect data and privacy, because in the European Union, privacy is considered a human right, not only offline, but also online. And then in this way, in this top-down approach, it was possible to create this legal framework for the first time around the world. And then now the GDPR is considered a reference regulation at international level. The second case, that's about ENISA. Then ENISA, if you remember, started as a non-permanent agency of the European Union. But after the approval of another regulation, the Cybersecurity Act, ENISA became permanent agency of cybersecurity for the European Union. And then this represents a maturity awareness achieved by the decision makers of the European Union and the policy makers. And then, in particular, if we consider the main aim of ENISA, which is to support member states to implement the initiatives approved by the governmental or by the regulatory or by the decision makers body of the European Union, to support the implementation and then to support the achievement of a common maturity level across the Union on cybersecurity. Then this represents another best case because it represents a bottom-up approach. Then we have a top-down approach represented by the regulations, but at the same time, the European Union gave the opportunity to the member state to use ENISA, to use the support of ENISA, to receive the support from ENISA to achieve the maturity level, equal, harmonious situation across the European Union, also with the capacity building programs, but also with the information sharing, and also with incident management, as Laura said before. Then this is why, in my opinion, ENISA represents a best case, because it's an operative, I'd say, operational arm of the European Commission, of the European Union in the field of cybersecurity. Then we have a strategic level, and then also we have an operational level. Now, to conclude.
Can you maybe follow up on that very quickly? Because I have the impression that we've been talking quite a lot about prevention of attacks, about monitoring of the incidents. And I was wondering, how are we doing in terms of contracting those attacks? How are we doing in terms of responding to those threats? How prepared are we to actually confront those issues that we are seeing in different member states? And maybe I would like to go back to Laura on this one. How is ENISA collaborating with member states to ensure that we actually have a response to those threats?
Thanks for the question. Indeed. So there it's, and you know, Luigi said a little bit about that cybersecurity is still seen by many member states as a national competence, because of course security is national security, and cybersecurity, well, it contains the word, so it's a bit vague. But what we also of course see is that cyber attacks, cyber incidents, they don't know any borders, and so it has been seen very clearly that we need to have some sort of European coordination in order to tackle this. And there, the Cybersecurity Act has been very important, because in this new mandate, it actually provided a role for ENISA there. And so there is now an important role in terms of coordination. And we do this like at different levels. And because you have the technical level, which is, you know, the guys who are actually responding to the incidents as they happen. You have operational level, and then you have kind of the strategic political level, and because often there's also strategic and political implications where cyber diplomacy would play a role. So we're trying to coordinate all of that. But I would say that it's still a challenge in Europe because this takes time. One of the key issues there is that you need to build trust. You need to build trust amongst the levels, amongst member states, because when a crisis hits, you need to be able to work together. So there's a lot being done, and there's more that's coming. So in June, the European Commission proposed the Joint Cyber Unit, which is one of the key goals for that is to improve the crisis management across Europe.
Thank you so much for that. Maybe I can come back to you, Luigi, about this question of a collaboration between member states in terms of cybersecurity diplomacy, right? Because we have here the external part of the collaboration that has a lot to do with the role that the European Union, as you were saying before, can have in terms of setting the standards, like the way they did with the GDPR. How do you see this coming together? Do you see that you're really being a strong force in terms of setting the rules of cybersecurity across the world?
Okay, and thank you very much for your questions. And of course, before to finish my intervention, that my last sentence is that it's important to enhance a common regulatory framework, establishing that cybersecurity is not internal affairs of member states, because it's a part of the European Union interest, vital interest, to consider a common cybersecurity strategy. But that said, about cyber diplomacy, it's another interesting topic, because at international level, we're assisting a very polarized situation where we have two kinds of positions inside, for instance, the United Nations, which is the temple of diplomacy at international level. Then we have, for instance, the position of European Union and other like-minded states, or maybe the United States and other like-minded states, which consider, for instance, the international law, the existing international law applicable, valid for the cyberspace. But we have other states like China, Russia, and other states around the world that consider the opportunity to have a new rules of the game. But the problem here is another one. Cyber diplomacy, then we have the cyber diplomacy toolbox of the European Union. Then it's valid, this approach? Yes, maybe. It depends how you use this one, how you're able to implement this toolbox. But the problem here, again, is if we consider at the European Union level, cybersecurity a topic of national security, or if we accept to a revolutionary approach, maybe, to consider cybersecurity as a part of the external action of the European Union, maybe. Then because of the toolbox, it was implemented, but the problem here is how we can use the toolbox, the cyber diplomacy toolbox, in case of cyber attacks, etc.
And how do you see actually these coming together? Because indeed we see that when it comes to foreign affairs, when it comes to security, the EU is very much divided. Do you see that there is a common stand when it comes to these issues among the 27 member states? Or do you feel that because there is fragmentation in the position that they take, it's very hard to actually come up with a common position on these issues at the global level?
I think that it's usable. It's not usable. It's as simple as practical. It's impossible to affront the cyber risks or cyber attacks alone. Then you consider, for instance, what happens with the United States, the colonial pipeline. Then the United States invest a lot of money on cybersecurity and cyber operations, also offensive cyber operations. But the investment, it's nothing if you don't have a common approach at an international level to respond and to prevent cyber attacks. Then, for instance, several member states of the European Union are part of the NATO. In the NATO, we are discussing how to implement a common defensive approach. Then maybe it should be very useful if the European Union will start to discuss how to implement a common defensive and offensive or proactive approach in the field of cybersecurity. Then also, again, in my opinion, it could be very useful if we start to consider another regulatory framework, maybe, or top-down or bottom-up approach. I don't have any idea how to implement it, but just to discuss with you that maybe it could be very useful if we have the opportunity to open also the discussion about how the European Union should be implemented their posture, external posture in the field of cybersecurity, and offensive and defensive terms. But the first point is to achieve a common maturity level. And then you remember, it's very important to remember that we have the Article 47 of the treaty and other article, but in particular, we have a common defensive framework inside our union. Then this is very important, in my opinion.
Thank you so much for that. I would like to remind our listeners, our participants, that they can also ask questions to our speakers if they have any. Otherwise, I'm gonna have a quick follow-up, because Francesco was like nodding very strongly when we were talking about this issue of cyber diplomacy, and I was wondering, how do you see the European situation? Do you feel that there is enough common ground to come up with a joint approach of all the member states, and how important is this when it comes to global threats that we are all facing and that we need to deal with?
Thank you, Beatrice, and thank you, the other speaker, for a wonderful intervention. Well, I think the common approach problem is not only concerning cybersecurity. No, it's concerning security. There are threats to be respected. There is the qualified majority on some issues. So if cybersecurity just fall into the categories of defense, the problem are the same, or any military operation. We're talking a lot about common defense this period, no? The European army, for instance, it's unthinkable that an European army will not imply the radio, the electronic warfare operation, which implies as well cybersecurity. Implementing tools such artificial intelligence, because others are doing that. I mean, talking in a very realpolitik terms now, I'm talking, so I don't want to be misunderstood, but of course, cybersecurity should fall into the categories of foreign affair. Another fundamental aspect that I can, wrapping up everything that has been said so far, so both talking about the economic, military, or information, disinformation, is the ongoing situation of European digitalization. Of course, COVID and the pandemic boost the digitalization, the use of digital means. People went online, not only hybrid but full. But thinking and promoting digitalization without cybersecurity, in my opinion, means that we are heading for an imperfect digitalization. What I would like to stress is, in general, if we are talking about defense capabilities, if we're talking about disinformation, or talking about stakeholders, we should talk in terms of awareness, first of all, and this again comes to the role of ENISA. And just to conclude, what can be done, which in turn could foster the internal market, the digital market, and the cybersecurity industry in Europe, not to rely only on external providers, could be to strengthen the ties between public and private sectors, which is something that has been done in the past years, has been started in the past years. So we have cybersecurity, European Cybersecurity Organization, which is doing this kind of taking care of this kind of relations. But if we talk in terms of strategy, which is cybersecurity is part of our European strategy, thinking in not 50 but 5 to 10 years, seeing the path how technology are developing. We should think in involving more the private sector, and I think this will also help all the rest of the issues and challenges. But I don't know, maybe other speakers have different opinion on that and they want to intervene.
I was actually going to touch on these issues, so I thank you very much for that. Indeed, it's unfortunate that we don't have anyone from the private sector. If there is any among our participants, please let us know, because I think it's a very interesting point that you made, and it actually links with something that Laura said before, and I wanted to ask her about that. And it's this question of these new technologies evolving and giving new features, but then at the same time, obviously, that means that we have new points of attack. And I was thinking particularly about the question of artificial intelligence, because we know that the European Union has been trying to push legislation in that area, that it's a very sensitive issue, but it's also a very sensitive issue because in terms of cybersecurity, it poses a huge threat. So I was wondering, how is ENISA dealing with this particular issue of new evolving technologies, and how much you are advising the European Commission in terms of making sure that the legislation that it passes in those areas actually takes into consideration this aspect of cybersecurity?
Thanks, Beatrice. One of the aims of ENISA, what we try to do is trying to make sure that cybersecurity is covered across all policy areas. I mentioned these 3 pillars of cybersecurity earlier, but of course we have all of these other digital policies, including artificial intelligence. We have a proposal also for a European digital identity. We have many, many more. And really, the idea is, of course, there that we also include cybersecurity within those policy areas. And this is something that we are working on, because the aim of if you take artificial intelligence, is for it to be trustworthy. And how do you make it trustworthy? Well, on the one side, you have all of those ethical issues that need to be looked at, but then surely the other side of that coin is that you make sure that it's secure so that people trust it when they're using it. So it's really important, and there ENISA provides a lot of different guidelines. We also did a threat landscape specifically for artificial intelligence to look at what the threats are when it comes to artificial intelligence. And there again, we uncovered, a variety of things and some of those link to the ethical side. For example, that if you use these libraries, that where are those libraries based? Who can access those, and can you manipulate those? So there is a lot of security issues, and so we're working with the whole cybersecurity community to provide recommendations on how we can secure these new technologies better. So that's a lot of the work that we do. And then the second thing is to try create some harmonization, because you have so many different new technologies. Some of the sectors even are now having their own legislation specifically for their area. So finance is having a specific digital resilience regulation, energy as well. So then we're trying to make sure that all of these different policies are harmonized, and that it's not, as Luigi mentioned, that we try to decrease the fragmentation, and rather we try to ensure that whatever the requirements set by each legislation are not overlapping, they are aligned with each other, and to make sure that all of those work together. So that's on the policy area, and then something that Francesco also mentioned is awareness. Of course, this is very important, because you need to create a certain awareness in order for both users, but also all organizations using the technologies are aware of what the risks are, in order to build better resilience, and that goes from the usual kind of cybersecurity month awareness for users like you and me, just to be careful and thinking before we click, as we say, to make sure that we're not a victim of something like a phishing attack. But it's also about creating situational awareness so that when an incident occurs, when a crisis occurs, that we really understand exactly what is happening and we have the right information at the right time.
I think it's very interesting that you touch on the individual cases of regular citizens, because this is something that we haven't quite discussed today. And I want maybe to come to a closure with interventions from all the three speakers on this one. On the one hand, the question of democracy and participatory democracy, the use of digitalization in terms of democracy, which is something that we have seen very much advance in some countries, not so much in others, but these also creates new forms of potential attacks that we have to tackle. And then there is another question, which is something that we discussed very much lately, and is the question of literacy, right? And we see that we have more and more threats and more challenges when it comes to the use of digital tools, and then at the same time that we do not have enough literacy among the population to actually make use of those tools. And I personally, when I reflect on cybersecurity, I realize how terrible I am at managing my own use of social media, or all the ways in which our life is digital now, and all the many ways in which I am not able to control what information is published, the control of my privacy, and so on and so forth. So I was wondering if you could all make like maybe a wrap up, a reflection on what are the challenges that you see in terms of the individual use of the digital world and the threats that we are facing, and what can be the role of maybe the European Union to come together and both raise awareness but also tackle all those issues, and how are they actually being tackled through the different strategies that we have in place. And maybe I'm going to start with Luigi, because it's been a while since we talked to you.
Thank you very much, Patrice. Then I think that we can summarize your intervention with the one word, cyber hygiene. Then maybe we can use it as a concept to summarize all the problem. What we need across the European Union, not all across the European Union, but at international level, we need a campaign, massive campaign of cyber hygiene at all levels, not only at low level of the society, no, because we have a problem, for instance, with the top managers. We have problems about cyber awareness at the political level. Then we have a problem also at, for instance, people which are very skilled on IT, but they don't aware about, for instance, their posture, their behavior in cyber, or for instance, on other part of the web, for instance, on social networks, etc. Then if you consider ransomware, for instance, then ransomware will attack the weaknesses of the chain. Who represented the weak link of the chain? The human behavior, then the human factor. Just to, okay, I have the opportunity also to share with you an example that a project that we are conducting here in Florence in the Center for Cybersecurity and International Relations Studies. It's called Cyber Readiness, with the main aim to measure the human factor on cybersecurity, or human factor in cyber incidents. Then we started from a specific question. Okay, we have several experts that say that 80% of cyber attacks occur for human behavior. Okay, let's try to measure. Let's try to validate this hypothesis. And then we started with a methodology. And then after the methodology, we use these methods to collect data from 6,000 people in Italy in order to measure the cyber readiness of each individual. not at organizational level only, but the behavior of the individual inside the organization. Why? Because we start to think about the effects of smart working. If you consider cyber attacks during the COVID, during the pandemic situation, lockdown in particular, we assist in a decreased situation of cyber attacks against classical targets, workplace, for instance. But at the same time, we have an increasing situation of cyber attacks at home, in our house perimeter. Why? Because we split our activities for the smart working. But the problem is, okay, we split the activities, but without any manual handbook on safety and security on cyberspace. That this is a problem. In other words, we don't give the opportunity to the people to implement a safe perimeter at IT level or virtual level or cyber level, you can call as you prefer, at home for the smart working. Then this is the question. The main question is about cyber hygiene. Another point is about cyber skill shortage. This is another very important point that I hope that we have the opportunity to discuss, or maybe to organize a specific meeting on this one, a conference, the skill shortage across the union, no, around the world, about cybersecurity and in particular new emerging technologies. Then we have a lack of cyber hygiene and the problem of a skill shortage. That's it, but I think that is enough. Thank you.
Thank you so much. But indeed, the question of education and skill shortages, I think it comes in every single session that we have about anything digital, right? Because this is something that we assume is just part of our world, but in reality, we actually lack a lot of those skills that are absolutely key to be able to behave in this digital world we live in right now. Maybe a reaction from Francesco on this one. How do you feel about this question of awareness? How do you think that impacts the question of democracy and the vulnerabilities that we see in this area?
Very, very quickly, because I mean, Luigi covered about, and Laura before, about awareness. Just to add to what he said, is not only skilling, but in my opinion, is only reskilling. I mean, we are switching, talking about digitalization again, to a lot of digital public services. But I mean, you have to train even, I mean, the 24 years old technicians, but the 50 years old employee that is already doing a public services, and suddenly she goes digital. Not only during it's not only limited to the pandemic and the smart working, home working, what do you want to go, but it's also when they come back to the office and they implement, because most of recovery plans have a lot of billions in digitalization, digitalization of public administration. And you have to train people, regardless of the age, that could potentially increase not capabilities, but yeah, somehow the awareness at least. The second thing, I wanted to conclude, is about privacy, because you touched upon before about among the challenges. I have really no response about privacy, because good steps have been done by the Commission, especially with new technologies such as AI, GDPR, of course. But this is very big and maybe worth be discussed at another event, a bigger issue, because we are constantly every day in our lives feeding some algorithm, no, for big data, for collecting big data about us. I mean, regardless of our settings, because they don't collect name, but they collect behavior to, how does it work? I mean, so yeah, privacy is another part of